with the garments, the separation of garments. The process involves 5 melachot, which are intricate, quite a few details, and I couldn't bring any pictures, but I brought a book that has pictures, so you're welcome to look at it afterwards. But I did make some drawings here to illustrate a little bit of what we're going to be covering. Much of this is not too relevant on Shabbat, but some of the applications are quite important to remind ourselves. So let's begin with the first melachah, that is toveh. Toveh means to spin. The wool has been sheared off the sheep, it has been bleached and cleansed, it has been combed, after which it has been dyed. So the process is somewhat complete as far as preparing the thread. However, what you have here is a bunch of thin threads that are still in a raw state. You can't do anything with them. They're limp. And the next logical step is to vishozer, or to spin. There's various ways that one can do that, to the many threads into a thick thread, the many fibers, I should say, into a thread that is usable. So that's called toveh. Toveh is the spinning, which can be done by hand, or can be done by machine, can be automated. And it's pretty much still done today in some places the way it was done hundreds of years ago. This process is, of course, a Surah Shabbat is one of the melachot. Take the fiber, vishozer, means whether you twist it or you somehow spin it into a thread. I wrote here in Hebrew, shuzira or kli'ah. Kli'ah is twisting, and there are various methods that are used depending what you make. Regardless of how you do it to accomplish, to make a thread, it would be a sur. There's a question, however, when you're making a rope, as you know, what is a rope? The rope involves doing a lot of things. So, according to one opinion, I believe it's the Rambam, the rope would also be called toveh. It would also, or actually something on, I think, Yerushalmi, that holds that based on the fact that, opinion that holds in Yerushalmi, that even taking 2 threads that are already complete, twisting them together to form a thicker host, is called toveh. That would also apply a heaven, one who's a rope. Others hold that the prohibition of making a rope falls under kosher, tying knots. Next week, with Hashem, we'll be covering the 4 melachot. I don't know if we can do all 4, but at least 2, which follow these, and they are kofer, kosher, korea, tying and untying, sewing and tearing. That comes next after this. Either way, a rope is a tool to make on Shabbat. This prohibition of toveh applies to not only wool, it also applies to, I wrote in Hebrew, flax, to cotton, canvas, silk, and even to hair. Regardless of which material you use, form it into a sort of thread, a fiber that can be used for tool. Another form of toveh or tviyah, yes, no, not the Torah just says that we can't do any melachah on Shabbat, right? All these melachot we learn from Mishkan. They're not stated in the Torah. Right? So this is what was done in the Mishkan, in preparing the various garments or the curtains, whatever needed to be woven. So you needed the wool, which had its own process, right? After which you have the thread, and now you have to make something in the thread. Of materials that can be used. Right, regardless, the rabbis say that any one of these materials can be used, even though wool was used a lot. These other materials, right, nylon too. Nylon will be prohibited too. Anything that is, it's a good question, anything that you would use to make a thread, of course, preparing a garment, that would be prohibited as well, not just wool. Right? Yeah, that we'll talk about next week. That's under kesher, tying the knot. Right? Right now, we're concentrating the weaving process, preparing a garment, using any of these materials to make thread, to make the thread, to make the whole thing would be prohibited. Right. If that comes under knot, right? We'll talk about that next week. What kind of knots you're allowed to make and what kind you're tying it together. But here, you're not really tying, even though when you take 2 threads, you twist them, you spin them to make a thicker thread. It appears like you're tying them, but you're not. That's called spinning or twisting. That's called tviyah, and that's the Surah Shabbat. Yeah, but we'll talk about that soon. It can be a problem, but not necessarily. Before we get to that, we have one more item here, that Asiyat Levadim. Leved is how you say it in English? Okay, leved is felt. Let's say you want to make a felt hat, right? The felt is the loose fibers, right? That the way it's done is, instead of weaving it, compressed by heat or by pressure. So you're having several layers of some fibers compressed on top of each other to form felt or whatever it is, whatever material you use. And you're not using anything to weave. That would be called a form of toveh too. Even though you're not twisting it, you're sewing, you're not doing anything to put these pieces together, the compressing by pressure by the various fibers together to make them stick together is also a form of tovei. Yes, oh. Yeah, we'll get to that. I'm going to back to the next item. Okay. Right now we're only talking about tovei. Tovei is the first step in preparing the garment. One needs to prepare the thread. So the area where perhaps we see it much more often on Shabbat, or actually during the week sometimes too, where you come across Liyah, is Tilim LeChanukah and Titit. A lot of people like to use cotton for the Chanukiah to make wicks. So that the Shabbat that is Chanukah, of course, you would not be able to make wicks of cotton by twisting. That would be an example which would be relevant nowadays for us, something that we think that will come up. Even though it may be a small amount, still associated. Another example would be Titit, if it unravels. See, that's the difference, not just twisting. If it unravels, unravel means it opens up. And the Tehutea Tzitzit, the strings are shazurim. They are twisted. In order to make a nice thick host tzitzit, you twist it, and it remains that way. But sometimes it unravels, it opens up. You cannot go ahead on Shabbat, be tovei again, or be shozer, the host itself again, to make it sticky. So these are two examples that one may come across with, nice to come across upon on Shabbat. We'll talk about that. No, you can. They're very good. They light very well to make good wicks. But on Shabbat, you would prepare it before Shabbat, right? First of all, on Shabbat you can't prepare for Motzei Shabbat anyway, right? But if you did, you would not be able to do it for another reason, to twist them, to prepare the cotton to wicks. Because as we said before, it applies to any of the materials. It would all be a sur. And this is a form of tovei, of spinning or twisting, forming it into threads or into wicks. Okay, I'm going to be switching back and forth so that you can see it on the illustration. The next melacha, perhaps I'll keep it here so you see it. After we have the threads, what do we do with the threads? How do we make clothes? Now, clothes, depending on what you're making, to be done in various ways. As you know, there are many patterns, there's different materials, there are different methods of making cloth, depending if you want very fine cloth or not. So I'm going to go through approximately the procedures that were used back then in the Mishkan, and some of it which is applied today, even though today it's automated and they use machinery, and it's much more complex. The following melachot that we're about to cover, 4 of them, are one of the most difficult melachot to understand. Most people do not even know that these are melachot. You ask an average Jew, what's mesach, what's la'asot shtei batei mirim, what's potse'ah, they would never give you an explanation. They have no idea what it is. And even if they knew or if they heard of it, it's very difficult to describe because you have to have an understanding of the weaving process. So the following 4 melachot deal exclusively with the weaving at different stages. There's various opinions as to where each one is, at what stage, and at what point, and how exactly it's done. I'm not going to get into too much detail, but a little bit we'll cover, just so you can have an idea of what's involved, and in case you want to learn how to make sweaters, this might help you. So the first one is mesach. Mesach is laying out what would be called in English the warp. There are 2 types of strings, or 2 types of threads that are used in making clothing. Warp and weft. Mesach is warping in English. Let's say, you see this over here, this frame, it's a black frame. On this frame, they will hang thousands of warped threads. The warped threads are the vertical ones. In Hebrew, that's called the sheti, chutei hasheti, okay? They are the ones that are going down vertically. So setting up, laying out these chutim, these threads, tying them over here on top and tying them here at the bottom, and they're parallel to each other, and they're quite tight. They can't be loose. In order to make a fine garment, it has to be done properly, it has to be done step by step, it has to be done correctly, otherwise it's not going to come out right. So they're laid out vertically. I'm going to be skipping around a little bit. The chutim, the red lines that you see, are what they would call in English the weft thread. In Hebrew it's called chotei ha'erev. They're the ones that go across. By having warp and weft threads interlaced with each other, that is how you form a beged, a garment. Alright? So the first step, after we've made the thread, to do mesach. Mesach means to prepare the chutei hasheti, or the warp threads down. The second step would be the actual aridah, the actual weaving. How do you weave? You take, depending on what you're using, there's various instruments that you can use. You take the chut ha'erev, or the weft, pass it through, and you pass it through in alternating threads. You don't just put it on top of them, or just on top of this, on the bottom of this, on top, at the bottom, on top of this. Alternate, okay? That's called the chutei ha'erev, or the weft. That is basically what almost completes the beged. That's called aridah. So I want to how it looks before we go on to. Now this will take many, many hours to do if you have to do this manually. You put thread by thread, pick up one, put it on the pick it up, put it on top, then go down. You're talking about thousands of threads, depending on what you're doing, what you're making. So in order to speed up the process, they came up, of course, with various ideas that are still used today, even though they're bigger, they're automated machines, but approximately the same idea. They came up with an idea called batenirim. In English, I think they're called heddles. Heddles are loops, little loops. They set up the today it's called a loom. And in this system of looms, you have these two squares, like frames, that have strings with loops in them, through which you put these warp threads. You put them through these loops. And there are pedals at the bottom. And what happens is, through the pedals, you are able to elevate, right? Through the loops, you are able to elevate the various warp threads. You elevate one, or more than one, and then you throw in the weft thread. Right? Then you put it down, up, down, because when you're pressing on the pedal, what you're doing is you're creating a gate, like an open area, between the threads that are here and the threads that are now here. And through that open area, you send all the way through, right, all the threads, you send that hota'eref, or the weft thread. And by doing it quickly, of course, into an automated system, you're able to speed up the process. Okay, so these are called the things that wanted to see before we go to it. Right, so we have the warp, or the hotea sheti. This melacha is called mistach. The sur, to prepare these, to lay it out. Ariga, or the actual weaving process, is laying out of putting through the hotea ha'eref, which are the weft threads, that's how we make the garment. And creating this is the melacha called la'asot shtei batei nirim, the suit to make two batei nirim. So there's also, in this area, there's also various opinions. What exactly is the prohibition, la'asot shtei batei nirim? But I first wanted to see what it looks like before I turn it around. Okay, so the batei nirim has to do with the loop, nestach has to do with laying out the warp, or the vertical thread, and ariga, or the weaving, because the hota'eref, the weft through horizontal. Any questions before I turn it over? Do you understand more or less how it works? Yeah, that's what we're getting at. Okay. Nobody, not necessarily, is going to make a garment, a complete garment on Shabbat. But nevertheless, there are times that even a partial tikkun, fixing a garment, or doing something to that garment, may fall under one of these categories. So, yes, this is not so relevant, it's not shayat, you won't find it in Shabbat too much, but it's important to know because at times, one may be doing something that resembles this, or is at least a toladah, which is also prohibited. Toladah meaning a melacha that resembles the av melacha, and it's different. Yes, they were done. In the time of the Mishkan, and before the Beit HaMikdash. They were always done. These are the melachot that were done in the Mishkan, to prepare the Mishkan. Right? Okay, so Mishkan, we explained, it involves the hotea sheti. Where is it applicable today, other than in garments? It can also be in the making of salim, in the making of baskets. In the making of baskets, you can also prepare, right, the straw or whatever you're using, vertically and horizontally, right, to make the basket. There are various ways of making the basket, but preparing the actual material that you're going to be using towards making the basket would also be asur for the same reason it's prohibited to make, to put the warp thread. The other melacha was la'asot shtei batei nirim, which was the lulaot, which was the loop. According to Rashi, it would not necessarily be, the prohibition would not necessarily be making the loop, but actually putting the thread or the string through the loop. But according to the Rambam, it's very interesting. The Rambam says that this melacha of la'asot shtei batei nirim is very applicable today, not necessarily in the garment industry, but in making nets, to catch fish. Nets. Because a net is a different, it resembles this, but it's very different. In what way is it different? That the threads are not close to each other, right? They're open a little bit, right? So even in preparing a net, you would have this problem, at least according to the Rambam. That's where it would be applicable today. Yes. Right, it can be, but when you're doing something, you may be transgressing more than one melacha. Yeah, you're not doing other things as well. There are quite a few examples of things where one may be transgressing 4, 5, or more transgressions by doing what he's doing. Okay, ariga, we explained, was the actual weaving process which involves the hotea ha'eref. I added something called the midbakadeh, which was another small little step. When they did it, especially manually, when they put the weft thread, it was not always, they had to somehow bring the threads down and compact them close to each other. You want to have a normal, right? When it was done manually. So they had a special tool that looked like a comb that they would be midbakadeh. Midbakadeh, the point that at least one of them would be to correct or to bring them down to compact all the threads close together. That would also. Alright, so where do we see ariga today? What could it be? So one example is in the li'at of a pe'ah, in the making braids. Now here I wrote pe'ah, not one's hair. What's the difference between one's hair and a regular wig? We spoke about it, and we talked about another example of tearing, or using a comb, pulling. There's a difference between combing your hair and combing the wig. The wig is not as problematic as one's hair. On the other hand, one should not comb the wig with a regular comb either, because it might be tearing. The soft comb, we spoke about the soft comb. With the regular comb, the problem with doing it on your hair was with the knots in the hair, or with pulling the hair. There were various problems, which was a form of tearing off. Whereas with the wig, it was more of a korea, which is not exactly the same, cutting, right? Because it's stuck to a piece of cloth, whatever they put those synthetic hairs to. So a wig was different than one's hair. The same is true over here. Braiding one's hair would be different than braiding a wig. They're both prohibited, but for different reasons. When it comes to braiding one's hair, we'll talk about it eventually. There's something called bonnet. Bonnet is like to build or to form something. In one's hair, that may be a problem of bonnet. Here, it would be more of a problem of arigah, because it's not one's hair detached. If you're braiding it, braiding is a form of arigah, a form of weaving, and it would be a suit. Another example of arigah where you have to be very careful, sometimes it happens that you're wearing a suit or a dress or anything, and you pass by some sharp object or nail that's sticking out, and it grabs you by the shirt or by the dress. It pulls a little bit at a string. Right. Sometimes we are tempted to fix it, to straighten it out. Sometimes you may be able to do that. I mean, you know how to do what you're doing. Because what do you have here? Remember, we have two types of threads. We have the warp and the weft threads. They are interlaced. And if one pulled out, one is out of place, all you need to do is to stretch it, right? And it will fall back into place. That cannot be done on Shabbat. Okay, that will be a form of arigah, the form of weaving. So the tikkun itself, the fixing of the thread, putting it back in place, pulling it, is a sur because of arigah. I'm coming there. This is the example of a regular tikkun to the beged where something is out of place. Okay, the next example would be strigah, knit, knitting. Using needles or whatever. That is another form of arigah that would also be a sur on Shabbat. So arigah is not necessarily, weaving is not necessarily just taking wasp and weft threads and interlacing. It can be done needles by needle or anything that's similar to that. It creates the beged of sorts, the garment. It would also be prohibited. Alright, the last melacha is posea. The Rambam calls this melacha posea, and he has a little bit of a different interpretation. So we're going to see several examples of what posea is. Posea is basically the end. After the garment has been woven, what do you do now? What do you do after the garment is finished? You cut the edges. So cutting the edges, according to the simple basic interpretation, is called that's a sur. The other opinions that hold is that posea involves not necessarily cutting the edges, but let's say a string, or one of the threads is loose. Right? By cutting it, to make it shorter, that would also be called posea. Or let's say it's already falling apart. So unraveling it and then stitching it back would also be called posea. In other words, posea involves some sort of tikkun at the very end, at the very last stage of the garment. The Rambam has an interesting interpretation of posea. He says posea is actually repairing. It's like patching. Let's say you open up at the very end. Let's say you want to connect two pieces of cloth, make a big cloth. How would you do that? Without making a seam. I have to ask the experts. How do you put two things together without making? How would you do that? How would you weave them together? They're already complete. Two pieces, right? You want it to look like one, right? The idea is you want it to look like one, and you don't have the machinery to make long. Right? Sometimes if you have the right machinery, then you can make long pieces of cloth. But if you did not do that, you just prepared, right, a certain amount of cloth separately, now you want to tie it together. How do you do that? It should look like it's all one. Smooth. It's possible. Right? What? It's possible. You open up the edges of the cloth and you take out the ered, right? You pull it out a little bit, the ered, in other words, the weft thread, and you take out the weft thread on the other end, and you weave again the sheti through them, right? See what I mean? The idea is opening up the edges, pulling them up, sticking through the sheti again, or the warp thread, and weaving them together. So you would have to open up and fix. That opening up and fixing, according to the Rambam, is botzea, which is what will be asur. Okay, real quickly, only have a few examples of what botzea is. One of the most common ones that people do not realize, and they do this quite often on Shabbat. Your example again of threads that are sticking out. Whether the threads are sticking out in the carpet, whether the threads are sticking out in your beged, in your shirt, in your suit, something, just a small little thread sticking out, you cannot go ahead and do this. Cut it. That's called botzea. What? You just leave it alone. Yeah, no problem. Just fold it a little bit. I mean, what? Right? You can put her around the button, do something, figure out something to do. Yeah. What? Right. You have to somehow find a way to hide it. Right? Not really. No. Anyway, you cannot on your own. I mean, if the goy, for example, the maid on her own, removes certain things for you, that's okay. But you cannot do it on your own. That would be called poter. I would have to think about it. Because it could be a problem of carrying. It's not the safety pin itself, the problem. It's the problem of carrying something on you that does not belong there. Right? Right. It's not, but I would have to think about it. It depends how it's done. Perhaps it could be done in such a way that it's mutar. So I'm not, I would have to think about it. That's one example that can happen and does happen. Another example is, just like we said, it's a suit to braid, to make braids on a wig and on one's hair too. The opposite of braiding would be opening up the braid. So opening up the braids on a wig would be a suit because of potzea. What is that? It's a suit, right? But it could be for different reasons. Right? For example, next week we'll be talking about tying and untying, the two separate things. Tying and untying. Okay, the last two examples are Futei Tzitzit and Futei Haflava, we call it that. And that, just like we said, it's a sur leshazer, shnei chutim, or to make tzitzit, to twist the two threads together. In the same way, it's a sur to unravel it, or to open it up on Shabbat. The last one is Haflava, stitches. If you have stitches anywhere, the threads that are used for the stitches, or for the stitching, you cannot unravel or open them up or remove them. So these are perhaps some examples that you may have found that would fall under the category of potzea, right? Obviously, doctor can stitch it for himself, but he has to be careful how he gets where he gets those threads from. We'll talk about it when we talk about the potzea, stitching, how he does it. Because even though you may be able to do something, you have to be careful that you do it the right way, the correct way. Another way which might be a sur. But obviously, only do stop with it. Okay, I think. Go ahead. Stuffed chicken. Right, we'll talk about that, I think, next week. Or no, 2 weeks from now. No, we'll talk about it under sewing. About sewing the chicken, right? And sewing up it, yeah. It would not come under this category. Yes.
It's good that they should do. You don't really, doctor has to cook. It's good that the doctor.
Yeah, obviously, yeah. Doctors also have to learn halachot, what they can do and for who they can and how they can. There's quite a few halachot. It's not easy to be a doctor. It depends who you're treating. You have to know what the condition of the individual is. When we talked about, you weren't here, we talked about medicine, medication, the various stages of illness. One with a small headache, it's very pikuach nefesh. There's various things you can do. Some things that you cannot do on your own, you can use a goy. So obviously a doctor needs to know the halachot, right? If you're, let's say your wife is giving, you need to know, and let's say she wants to give birth at home, not at the hospital. So there's quite a few things involved, like cutting the umbilical cord, for example, right? And doing other things that may involve certain halachot. Obviously, for that, it would be permissible to give birth, in other words, to deliver, the child. The pikuach nefesh, the situation where the mother is in danger. So there are several things you can do, but certain things you may have to do it differently, depending if it's immediately necessary or not for the woman. So there's the Chot Shabbat are not quite a few halachot and details. One needs to continuously review the halachot, otherwise we forget what to do. You're in a hospital, you may forget that there is automatic doors. Just to be aware of this. Aware when you go to places where they may have things that you're unprepared for, like lights. As soon as you pass by, the light goes on. Motion light. What do you do? So because of the technology today, you have to delve deeper into the halakha and try to figure out what's mutar and what's asur based on the fundamentals of Ilchot Shabbat that we know, the Yisodot of Ilchot Shabbat, how to apply it today with modern technology. Well, how do we deal with timing? So a lot of this, for example, today is done with machinery, but it's still asur. Make no difference how you do it. Regardless of the method, if you create a garment or prepare a garment, any one of those 5 melachot, any one of those 5 steps, it's still prohibited, regardless how you do it. But it's good to know when you see a machine, you can identify the various steps and processes which still exist, and they still happen even with modern machines. See every one of them today as well. So even though they may not be applicable and may not be relevant too much, there are a few applications, as we saw, that can occur every Shabbat, and it's good to know anyway, because I don't know, you come across somebody who's not religious and they like knitting sweaters, right? Or doing all sorts of things. In Shabbat they have nothing better to do than start with. You can tell them this is a sur. Why? Because it's called Asiyash Batenirin, or it's called Putea. What's that? So anyway, it's important to become familiar with the various melachot, because some of them do have applications in today. Yeah. Right. So, eventually, with Rabbi Hashem, we'll talk about the various issues that are midrabanan, or that come under the category called grama. Grama means that you're causing them, but you're not doing it. Like opening up a refrigerator door, not because of the bulb, not the light bulb. I'm not talking about the light bulb, because the light bulb you're directly causing it. As soon as you open, it's going to happen. That's called Psikin Hashem. But the example of a refrigerator door, when you open, it makes it go on. Like with an oven, with a thermostat, makes it. How do you deal with that? So if something is a grama, it's still prohibited, but there are ways to get around it. What do you do if you forgot the light bulb in the fridge? You cannot open the door on Shabbat. There are ways to open it up. We'll get to it. No, not with the Shiva. There are some creative ways that would not be prohibited and perfectly permissible. Yeah, sure. Eventually, why did they come back? Oh, for this Shabbat, just take out the light bulb before Shabbat. No problem. We don't have the light bulb on the whole week, so you don't have to remember to turn it off. Yes. So now you're getting close. See, you're thinking. Yeah, now you're thinking. You still have to think a little bit more. How do you accomplish that without disconnecting the generator that's working? Aha! So now you're on the right track, right? Then you disconnect it. Basically, that it would involve those steps. Not exactly. No. It depends on the refrigerator. We'll talk about the various types of refrigerators. No, not in this. You just have to do the proper thing. There are ways to do it. We'll talk about it. Now we talk about garments. Okay, that basically covers it. These are 5 melachot. They were short melachot, so there's not too much involved here. It's just complex because of how it happens. And if you want to see the pictures, the procedures, the steps, this book has nice, colorful pictures. You're welcome to see it. Yeah. Between Shabbat and Yom Tov, there are quite a few differences. Every year I review the Luchot Yom Tov, the basics that one needs to know of what applies. No, we do it on Yom Tov, to remind people what they can do, what they cannot do. But to get into a full discussion of the differences between Shabbat and Yom Tov, maybe we'll do that too. There are several things that I do. Yom Tov, basically what's permissible is preparation of food, and carrying, putting on one flame from another list. These are the 3 basics. But there are also differences, Shayach, for example, in the Code of Moshe. Other melachot that may be prohibited in Shabbat, but because they're necessary for the preparation of food, that you may not be able in Shabbat, since it's part of preparing the food for cooking, you may be able to grind it, for example, you do whatever you do to prepare it for cooking. So maybe we'll get into that once we finish it. If you did it by accident, you did it by accident. You didn't intend it. But just remember, when something happens by accident, it's called a shgaga. And if there would be a Bet HaMikdash, we would bring a korban chatat. And anytime you do something by accident, it's not a good sign either. That's something else. That's not good. No, that's very good. There's some things that are under your control, some things that are not under your control. And there's a question if it's a real melacha or not, with floodlights. Motion lights? No, motion lights. There's a question. Anyway, any questions about how to make garments? Yeah, go ahead. It's not about he wanted. No, that's a whole different discussion. It's also a little technical, but that involves on how you calculate the day. Do you calculate it from sunrise to sunset, or do you calculate it from dawn to nighttime? Nighttime meaning when the stars come out. That's all. So depending on how you calculate daylight, you are able to determine when Shekiah is, how long Shekiah is, sunset. There are various issues that there are a bit different opinions on. Because of that, the day is a little longer or a little shorter depending when you start counting. This also affects the time of Kriyat Shema, the time of prayer, of Shachrit. When is Chatzot? Depends on when you started counting. When is the end of Kriyat Shema? Right? Depending when you calculate that. So it's not that some people wanted an extra hour. It depends how you calculate, depending on which opinion you follow, as far as how you calculate the length of the day. That's not exactly so. It's the fire to follow it in time. It is simple to that effect. So some things are not exactly majority or not minority. It could be majority of the Jews one way. But a lot of even Ashkenazi Jews are Mahmir, especially the Hasidics, many times. So depending what it is, if it's a fast or if it's Shabbat is big effect. If it's still Shabbat or not, then you have to be more careful. But with the fast, we're more lenient. So lenient, as soon as it's nighttime, especially when it's over with. But by the time you make Birkat HaLevana anyway, Rebbe Tam has a different opinion on the seder of the Parshiyot, on how they're laid out. Some people put on both pairs. The Yosei, the Chovah, his opinion. Yeah, either at the same time or one right after another. Yeah. Okay, the Hashem next week we'll cover the other melachot which are very, very relevant. Knots, what kind of knots, the untying of knots, sewing, and hammering. These are the following 4 melachot.